Hello, and welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero. We have come to episode 42 of the show, and rather than discussing the meaning of life, we are covering Nintendo Power number 30 for November of 1991. After much deliberation, I decided to start doing full reviews of the games in the SNES Spotlight. This will make for longer episodes, but that will hopefully mean that each of the two parts will be closer to 10 to 15 minutes. So, we've got a lot of ground to cover this time. Let's get started. Our cover game this issue is Final Fantasy II. The cover has a character from the game, I'm assuming it's Edgar the Bard, flying towards a castle on a black chocobo. This time in the letters column, we have letters from readers saying what celebrities they'd like to play Game Boy games with. Probably my favorite of all of these is the writer who wants to play Tetris with former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. It's actually a novel concept, as far as playing a game with a head of state, in particular a game which their country has become famous for putting out. I'm not sure who I'd pick to play with, but I know that the game would probably be either Tetris or Radar Mission. Anywho, our first game of the issue is The Flintstones, a platformer based on the Hanna-Barbera animated sitcom, and the guide gives maps of the first overworld map and some early stages. If I was to explain the problems with this game in one word, it's that it's slippery. I don't mean that in a figurative sense, that the game's mechanics are hard to grasp, but it keeps changing things up on you. No, it's that the game's physics are literally slippery. Like, every level in the game is an ice level. Fred Flintstone, when he stops receiving controller input after you started him moving, moved about a full body width, or sprite width, before stopping. That's not if the player is pressing the run button before, when he's moving. It's just by default, the normal move animation. Mario doesn't take that long to stop moving. Mega Man doesn't take that long to stop moving. Simon Belmont doesn't take that long to stop moving. Now I realize this is a game based on a cartoon, and if you watch the Flintstones cartoon, when Fred moves, or for that matter, other Hanna-Barbera characters like George Jetson or Yogi Bear or the Scooby Gang, if they stop moving from a run, they tend to skid to a stop in a sort of uncontrolled fashion, unless they're doing just a general walk. However, that skidding and the almost uncontrolled motion that comes with it is something that's done for comedic effect, and it works when you're doing slapstick cartoons. When you are designing a video game, especially a platformer, the requirements are different. It's a case where you have to take some elements of look and feel of the work in question and put them aside for the sake of gameplay, for the sake of playability, and how fun the game is to play. How well it controls. So, when you, metaphorical you, are designing the run animation and run physics for that character, the question you should be asking yourself is, do you take the physics and inertia from the character in the original work and design the level around those animations by making levels where there's no need for precise jumps, where you can have the skidding and not worry too much about it? Or do you dump that aspect in favor of making the animations fit the levels, by dumping your uncontrolled run, or your skid, or the skid, or that sort of thing from the work, and just having a more tight, precise jump to fit to the tight, precise level design? The developers of the Flintstones chose to do neither, to keep the animation from the show, while designing the world for more precise controls, and it simply doesn't work. I almost wonder if this game began its life as something else, and then the developers got the Flintstones license. In Nestor's adventures for this issue, Nestor is playing go-karts as a proxy for F-Zero, and the tip for this game being that sometimes you gotta ram a foo. It's a certainly more useful tip from last time, though, you know, The Howard and Nestor strips always have the two basically going from game world to game world in some form or another. These intrusions of the real world, by contrast, seem forced. I'd kind of rather that we just had Nestor in the game worlds, rather than having these Calvin and Hobbes or Walter Mitty style fantasy sequences. In the classified information column, we have more tips for Super Mario World, showing how to get more 1-ups, and a revised version of the Konami code for Gradius 3 on the Super Nintendo. Speaking of the Super Nintendo, we now come to our cover game, Final Fantasy II. Now, unlike the Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest guides, we don't get detailed maps or recommended levels for particular parts of the story, or item stats for shops, but we do get story guidance. Now, before Final Fantasy VII came out for the PlayStation 1, and introduced a generation of gamers to Japanese RPGs, Final Fantasy II, or Final Fantasy IV, as it was originally titled, and which I'll be calling it for basically the rest of the episode, did the same thing for gamers in the 16-bit console generation. There are very, very good reasons why this game is so well regarded. In short, Final Fantasy IV takes the basic concept of the first Final Fantasy, a quest for the 4 crystals, and changes it dramatically by building an incredibly strong, though linearly structured, narrative around the gameplay and the quest for protecting the crystals and recovering them and that sort of thing. The game's plot, it's so well known that I don't particularly have to get into it here, so instead it's worth getting into what this game does differently. In addition to introducing several new jobs, like the Dark Knight the Paladin, the game has a dramatically larger scope compared to earlier titles in the series, one that I'd argue wouldn't really be matched until the release of Final Fantasy VI. In terms of going on the surface of the Earth, underground, into the Dwarven Realm, and all the way up to the Moon. However, because this game is such a gateway for such people, it feels less definitive, at least the SNES version does, due to all the re-releases with graphical overhauls and gameplay tweaks. Between this version, the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation 1, the DS, and mobile versions, you can find a copy of this game with almost minimal effort, and all of these versions will in their own ways be a little better than this one, whether it's having tooltips to remind you what spells do, or better spell naming, because they can do the whole Cure, Cura, Curaga thing, as opposed to Cure 1, Cure 2, Cure 3, and having a bestiary with monster information you can look up, and that sort of thing. Or, for that matter, telling you when you look at weapons, how they affect how the weapons affect your stats. Whether they're better than what you've currently got. Still, as far as the game itself is concerned, particularly at this time, this is a solid game that fixes a lot of the gameplay problems from the first Final Fantasy. Your characters are not blank slates. They have their own personalities, their own motivations for their actions, starting from the very beginning of the game. And additionally, with this, from its raw mechanical standpoint, your characters will retarget enemies when an enemy is killed, so you can safely gang up on an enemy if possible. There are enemies where you have to pay attention to what they're doing and not just blindly attack them. You have the ability to put your characters in block mode, that sort of thing. I also feel like there is less of a focus on grinding in this one. There's certainly still grinding that is done, and if you really want to break the game, you can just super grind if you really want to. But it feels like, at least for the early portions of the game, maybe a little more later, you don't have to grind as much as you would in, say, the original Final Fantasy or in the Dragon Quest games to get ahead in the game. That said, the game has a very slow start. You don't get to actually control your characters until about 10 minutes in, to really control the characters, and you don't actually get to buy weapons and armor until the 30-minute mark. Additionally, the rapidly cycling party members through the game, in terms of having characters die or fake die, or be presumed to die, and having new members popping in, can cause problems where when you find a party lineup that you really like, and then have to dump the characters that you were accustomed to and enjoyed having in your party. Further, the fake-out deaths for party members later on gets frustrating and undermines any gravitas that many of those scenes thus have. It does heighten it whenever one of these deaths is real, but otherwise it feels kind of less when you're on the second character who was presumed dead and then has suddenly come back. In Counselor's Corner, we get advice on getting across the first of the Butter Bridge levels in Super Mario World, along with advice on beating Si Ma Yi in Destiny of an Emperor. Next up is our next edutainment game. We haven't had one in a while. Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego for the Super Nintendo? We have a guide for the game along with a walkthrough of one case. This is a generally good port of the game, preserving the gameplay and making the interface navigable from the PC version. I mean, complexity-wise, the game is less based around navigating difficult puzzles or having to steer a complicated vehicle and more around making notes of clues you need to solve the case. Additionally, I'd say this game, more than Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego in terms of the earlier versions, holds up in this current age of smartphones and Google. In terms of being completable without the book that came with purchase of the game. As you can use the internet to look up answers to clues in terms of, who was Prime Minister of this country when, or when was this person Queen of Holland, or that sort of thing, without having to play pages of the book, as opposed to Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, where, for example, they may be referencing gross domestic product information that is no longer valid, or key export information that is no longer valid due to economic changes and climate changes and political changes. My primary complaint about this game, though, is that some of the time limits for cases that you face are just too small to be completed in the time available. I've had situations where I figured out where I need to go next. That part's fairly straightforward, but because I also need to keep asking around to find additional information about my suspect so I can get a warrant when I catch up to them, I end up wasting turns before moving on. It's kind of a nuisance. Alright, next up, Activision is a combat flight simulator with ultimate air combat for the NES. Fighter combat games, at this time in history, are not ready for console prime time. On PCs, you have the myriad number of controller inputs or keyboard inputs on the keyboard itself, plus you have a flight stick. Everything's peachy keen. Here, not so much. Piloting your plane is a royal pain in the butt in terms of general flying, in terms of lining up a shot on enemy aircraft. I think it's safe to say that, honestly, in terms of console flight sims, as much as people say, games were better back in the day than they are now, console flight sims have only gotten better in time. Not only in terms of graphical fidelity, but more importantly, with controls. Next up is another platformer based on a cartoon with Tom and Jerry. A platformer where you control Jerry and try to rescue his nephew Tuffy from Tom. This is a platformer based around navigating various mazes and platforms. It, frankly, doesn't control very well, and it also doesn't feel conducive to the spirit of the Tom and Jerry cartoons. Something that felt like Tom and Jerry would be something where you're avoiding traps set by Tom and possibly using those traps or other aspects of the environment against him. This game, you're fighting generic enemies in a sort of house environment. This is again another one of those games where it could have started its life as something else entirely as a Japanese platformer, and then got turned into a Tom and Jerry game for a US release. We'll probably get a good example of what we're looking for and what I'm looking for in terms of a good adaptation of a intellectual property or a cartoon to a video game in a Bugs Bunny game on the Super Nintendo a little later.